Hello, everybody. Welcome back. It is Wednesday, and today we're going to be going over something in the 30 Life Principles Bible study that is written by Charles F. Stanley. It is the Life Principle 6. You reap what you sow, more than you sow, and later than you sow. Ken's going to go over kind of what they're talking about, and then we're going to go over a few discussion questions, and then I think that's when we're going to end off for today. So I'm going to pass it over to Ken.
Okay. Yeah, the title of this is You Reap What You Sow, More Than You Sow, and Later Than You Sow. Dr. Stanley, he starts out using this example of a farmer. And how he explains it is when a farmer is planting his crops, he'll put one kernel of corn in each hole. And then he takes care of that. It's watered, it's fertilized, and the other things you have to do with corn. And then out of that one kernel grows a stalk of corn. Now, normally a stalk of corn will have two ears to it. And as an average, each ear will have approximately 700 kernels per ear, which means if you get 2 ears of corn on a stalk, it's around 1,600 kernels. And Dr. Stanley's point is by planting one kernel in time, you'll reap a harvest of 1,600 kernels. His point is it takes time, though. It's not an immediate process. You plant it in April, and come October is normally the harvest season. So there is a later period in which you recognize or you realize the fruits of that labor. He goes on to say, though, that, and this has to do with our decision making. And I have another scripture. It comes out of Proverbs, and I'm going to read it because I think it makes a lot of sense to what he's talking about. It says, sow a thought, reap an action. Sow an action, reap a habit. If we sow a habit, we're going to reap a character. And if we sow a character, we're going to reap a destiny. And it just talks about our thought life, how we make decisions. If we make good decisions, we are going to reap a good harvest. If we make bad decisions, we're also going to reap a harvest, but that harvest is going to have unintended longer-term consequences. And Dr. Stanley goes on and says, we cannot sow disobedience to God and expect to reap his blessing. What we sow is what we reap. And he goes on to talk about that what we are today is a result of our thinking and the way you have lived in the past. So if you were raised to be responsible, to be good decision makers, to have a strong work ethic, the probability is when you hit your adult years, those attributes will transfer on to your adulthood. Whereas if during your childhood, adolescent, you didn't make good decisions and you developed bad habits, the probability is by the time you hit adulthood, those habits are once again going to continue into adulthood. I'm going to read out of Galatians 6, verses 6 through 10, that speaks more about the sowing and reaping. And it says, let him who is taught the word share in all good things with him who teaches. Do not be deceived, for God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, he will also reap. For he who sows to the flesh will of the flesh reap corruption. But he who sows to the Spirit will of the Spirit reap everlasting life. So let us not grow weary while doing good, For in due season we shall reap if we do not lose heart. Therefore, we have the opportunity. Let us do good to all, and especially all those who are in the household of faith. And then we go on where Dr. Stanley talks about it's a dangerous thing to think God won't mind. He does mind when we disobey. We may not immediately see the consequences of those actions, but they will be forthcoming. And that goes back to the verse in Proverbs that I read in terms of what we sow, the decisions, the thought lives we have, the decisions we make from that thought life do have long-term consequences. To go on with what Dr. Stanley is talking about, just to kind of summarize this chapter before I turn it back over to Alexis, is as a follower of Christ, we may become discouraged when the present seed you are sowing does not appear to be producing an immediate crop. Maybe, for example, you have been sharing the gospel with a loved one and praying for her to come to Christ. You have been waiting for the seeds you have sown to come to harvest, but nothing has happened. What you must remember is, unlike the crops of the field, which get harvested at the same time each year, there is no timetable for the harvest of life. Because the harvest of life, it will come according to God's timetable, not our timetable. And it's also important to remember there's a regular timetable for the harvest of life. Some crops reap quickly, others take a long time. But do not be deceived, their season will come. And by going the second mile now and giving more than is required, you will reach rich dividends later. Because sometimes it'll be the smallest decisions that we make will have the greatest effect on the future outcomes. So I'm going to turn it over to Alexis, and she will finish up this lesson.
Yes. So Ken already read this, but I'm going to reread it just so it makes more sense with the question, just in case you may have, so you're more aware. It says, it's written in Galatians 6, 6 through 10. Let him who has taught the word share in all good things with him who teaches. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, he will also reap. Then it goes on to ask that how are people often deceived into thinking that they won't reap what they sow? Paul says, do not be deceived. So that's kind of what we're going based on. And I believe that they will. I think they won't reap what they sow, or they think they won't reap what they sow, because they also have a deception that they know better than what God does. And since they believe in their way, and if they believe their way is the righteous way instead of God's way, why would they think they're going to reap anything? If you truly believe that your way is the right way, even though that's so very false, a lot of the time you think that you're not going to reap these things that you're sowing. And I think a lot of the time people are often put in a position where they have to turn back around and face God, because they always do end up reaping what they've sown. And then going on to day 17, I believe Ken's going to go through that. It's a universal truth that is written here in the 30 principles.
Okay, let me get to that right now. Oh, okay. It goes back to the principle of reaping what you sow. More than you sow, later than you sow. And it applies to everyone, whether one's a believer or whether one is a non-believer. It's a universal law. We saw in Galatians 6:7 what Paul talks about in terms of thinking that we can make bad decisions and yet we're going to reap good results. That's not the law of life. And to give you an example, I deal with some young mothers. And when they initially come in, we start talking about sowing and reaping. And we get to the point of they have this idea that their child is a result of decisions they made earlier. And the child is not. The child is a blessing. The consequence or the reaping that they've sown is for the rest of their life, they're going to be a parent. And when they come in, generally speaking, they don't want to be pregnant, but they are. But for them, they have not thought through why I chose to be involved in sexual activity before marriage. Well, that decision is always going to result in a consequence that for many young kids is they see it as an unintended consequence. But then it puts them in a situation where once the baby is born, from that point on, they're now a parent, which means many of the young ladies I deal with are in their teenage years, which means they're going to lose their teenage years. They're also going to lose most of their 20s because now they have a child to care for. And I don't think a lot of these young women take that into account when they're making decisions. And again, part of it is how they were raised, and part of it is who they associate with during those teenage years. But regardless of those two issues, it still comes down to we've been given free will, we've been given the choice, a free choice. And there's times when we don't make good choices. And it's important to understand that a lot of times the consequences are going to last far longer than what we ever anticipate. And that's the universal truth that Dr. Stanley's talking about. So I'm going to turn it back over to Alexis.
So under 17 it says the Israels had a long history of reaping what they sowed. When they sowed faithfulness and obedience to God, they reaped blessings. When they sowed adultery and disobedience, they reaped judgment. Why do you think it is so difficult for each generation to learn the lessons of the past? And I think each generation truly believed the good outcomes were installed by themselves. Even with the consequences of disobedience, it was not set up in a perspective of God's will, but simply of their own. They still had more honor and free will rather than God's. And I think that's something that I see a lot in my generation and even some past generations. Yeah. And then down here it says, when Israel chose her king without the Lord's guidance, they ultimately regretted it. God wants to be immediately involved in all the things of our lives, are intimately involved in all things or in all details of our lives, especially in the major decisions that shape our futures.
Yeah, I want to add on to that what Alexis said. I think this generation, Generation Z generation, has this mindset that they have no fear, that it may happen to their friends, but it's not going to happen to them, even though they've made the same decisions their friends have. And I think it takes us back to what Paul's talking about in Galatians 8 through 10, where he says once again, for he who sows to the flesh, which is to our natural self, will of the flesh reap corruption. But he who sows to the Spirit will of the Spirit reap everlasting life. And I think what Paul's talking about there is so often we make decisions every day. We make hundreds of decisions every day, probably thousands. And I think we have to ask ourselves, how often when we're making these decisions do we consult the Lord? And how many of these decisions, especially the more significant decisions, how many of them do we just leave him out of the equation? And yet we're expecting to get blessings from that, but we don't, because by not referring to him and seeking his direction, it's a form of disobedience. And God doesn't honor disobedience, nor does he bless disobedience. So that kind of is a follow up to what Alexis was referring to.
Um, and then on to day 8, the coming yield. Did you go over this part yet?
No,
Okay.
this part, which Alexis is going to go over, comes out of Matthew 25:32 to 34, and it's the parable of the sheep and the goats.
Yeah.
So I'll turn it back over there.
So I'm going to read what this says in Matthew 25:32. It says, "All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate them one from another, as a shepherd divides his sheep from the goats, and he will set the goats on his right hand, but the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right hand, 'Come, you blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundations of the world.'" Then it goes off to ask, what do the sheep and goats represent in this parable? And the basic answer is the sheep are the people who are obedient to God's will. And the goats are the people who believe they need obedience to themselves or to man, like a king or somebody set up, and almost in like a corrupted hierarchy where they believe man is one who's righteous instead of God. And what it's basically saying is the sheep that are separated from the goats on the right hand are going to go to this kingdom. They're going to have basically heaven almost. And God doesn't want anything bad to happen to us. That's why he's constantly knocking on the door, but that doesn't mean that people are always willing to listen. And at the end of the day, there are some goats, is what they like to represent it as. And that's the people who think that they're only obedient to themselves or to somebody that they believe is righteous other than God.
I want to go ahead and I want to finish up that Matthew 25, because I think the rest of this is equally important.
Yeah.
Because he's separated the sheep from the goats.
Mhm.
And the sheep respond to him. Then the righteous will answer, saying, "Lord, when did we see you hungry, feed you, thirsty, or give you to drink? When did we see you a stranger and take you in, or naked and clothe you? Or when did we see you sick, in prison, and come to you?" And the Lord will answer them to say, "Assuredly, I say to you, inasmuch as you did to one of the least of these, my brethren, you did to me." So what the reward is for the righteous is everlasting life. Then he turns to the goats, and those individuals said, "Well, we never saw you. We never saw the sick. We never saw the needy. We never saw the homeless, the ones in prison. We didn't realize it was you." And he's saying, because you didn't see me in them and you didn't serve them, you didn't serve me. Therefore, he casts them off into the eternal damnation.
Yeah. All right.
Were you going to do any more?
I don't think so.
Okay, yeah, we're going to close. This wasn't going to be a long podcast, but I think the question I want to leave with everyone is, do you seek God's leadership when you're making decisions? Do you obey him as soon as you know his will? Sometimes it'll be in the small decisions that will affect you the very most. So we're going to leave you with that. We will be back tomorrow evening, and we will be doing chapter 3 in the Prodigal God. So hopefully everyone has a enjoyable evening, and we'll be back at 4:00 tomorrow.
Yes, I appreciate you guys listening.